On a crisp autumn morning in the quiet suburb of Millbrook, Connecticut, the tranquility of Maple Street was shattered by a blood-curdling scream. It was September 15th, 2018, when Sarah Thompson, out for her usual morning jog, stumbled upon a scene that would haunt her and the entire community for years to come. There, sprawled across the manicured lawn of 1478 Maple Street, lay the lifeless body of Jessica Hartley, a 32-year-old real estate agent and mother of two. Her blonde hair, usually meticulously styled, was matted with blood, and her blue eyes stared vacantly at the sky above. The emerald green dress she wore, a favorite among her friends, was now stained a dark crimson. As police sirens wailed in the distance, neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by a morbid curiosity that would soon give way to fear. Jessica Hartley wasn't just any resident of Millbrook. She was the golden girl, the one who seemed to have it all: beauty, success, a picture-perfect family. Who could have wanted her dead? Detective Michael Reeves arrived at the scene at 7:45 a.m., his coffee barely touched and already cold. With 15 years of homicide experience under his belt, Reeves thought he'd seen it all. But something about this case sent a chill down his spine. As he approached the body, he noted the lack of struggle in the surrounding grass. Either Jessica knew her killer, or she had been taken completely by surprise. The victim's husband, James Hartley, was nowhere to be found. Neighbors reported that his car had been missing from the driveway since the previous evening. Was he a grieving husband, unaware of the tragedy that had befallen his wife? Or was there more to his absence than met the eye? As the forensics team combed the area for evidence, Detective Reeves began the grim task of notifying the victim's family. Jessica's parents, Robert and Linda Carson, lived just 2 streets over. The short drive felt like an eternity as Reeves rehearsed the words no parent should ever have to hear. The Carsons' reaction was a mixture of disbelief and anguish. Between sobs, Linda managed to choke out, "But we just had dinner with them last night. Everything seemed fine. How could this happen?" Robert Carson, a retired police officer himself, asked the question that was already forming in Reeves' mind. "Where's James? Does he know?" As the day progressed, a clearer picture of Jessica Hartley's final hours began to emerge. She had indeed had dinner with her parents the night before, accompanied by James and their 2 children, Emma, 7, and Ethan, 5. They had left around 9 p.m., with James saying he had some work to finish at his law office. Jessica had opted to drive herself and the kids home, mentioning something about having to make a phone call. The children, thankfully, had been at a sleepover at their grandmother's house. They were blissfully unaware of the tragedy that had struck their family, at least for now. As news of the murder spread through Millbrook like wildfire, reporters descended on the once peaceful street. Local news vans jockeyed for position, each hoping to catch a glimpse of the crime scene or a soundbite from a shell-shocked neighbor. One such neighbor, Diane Foster, seemed particularly distraught. "Jessica was more than just a neighbor. She was my best friend," she told a reporter from Channel 8 News. "We talked every day. She seemed happy, but lately, I don't know, something was off." When pressed for details, Diane hesitated before adding, "I shouldn't say this, but Jessica had been acting strange for the past few weeks. Secretive phone calls, coming home late. I hate to even think it, but was she having an affair?" The question hung in the air, adding another layer of complexity to an already baffling case. Detective Reeves, overhearing the interview, made a mental note to have a more in-depth conversation with Diane Foster. If Jessica Hartley had indeed been involved in an extramarital affair, it could blow the case wide open. As the sun began to set on that fateful day, casting long shadows across Maple Street, one question loomed larger than all others. Where was James Hartley? Detective Reeves sat at his desk, surrounded by crime scene photos and preliminary reports. The autopsy results had come in, revealing that Jessica Hartley had died from multiple stab wounds, likely inflicted by a large kitchen knife. The time of death was estimated between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. The most pressing issue remained the whereabouts of James Hartley. His cell phone was going straight to voicemail, and his credit cards hadn't been used since the previous afternoon. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Reeves's partner, Detective Sarah Chen, entered the office, a stack of papers in her hand. "I've got James Hartley's phone records," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "You're going to want to see this." The records showed a flurry of text messages and calls between Jessica and an unknown number in the weeks leading up to her death. The last call from this number was at 10:45 p.m. on the night of the murder, lasting only 2 minutes. "We need to identify this number," Reeves said, his detective instincts kicking into high gear. "And I want to know everything about James Hartley's movements in the last 48 hours. As the investigation intensified, the media frenzy grew. The story of the murdered suburbanite with a possible secret life had captured the nation's attention. Talk shows debated the case, and true crime enthusiasts dissected every detail released to the public. 3 days after the murder, with still no sign of James Hartley, the police held a press conference. Chief of Police Eleanor Barnes stood before a sea of microphones, her face grim. "We are officially naming James Hartley as a person of interest in the murder of his wife, Jessica Hartley," she announced. "We urge Mr. Hartley to come forward and assist us in our investigation. To anyone who may have information about his whereabouts, please contact the Millbrook Police Department immediately." The announcement sent shockwaves through the community. Those who knew the Hartleys couldn't believe that James could be involved. He was known as a devoted father and a respected attorney. How could he possibly be capable of such a heinous act? As the investigation continued, Detective Reeves and his team began to uncover layers of complexity in Jessica Hartley's life that no one had suspected. Her computer and phone revealed a woman living a double life, one that threatened to shatter the illusion of suburban perfection she had so carefully crafted. But was it enough to get her killed? As Detective Reeves delved deeper into Jessica Hartley's digital life, a complex web of deceit began to emerge. Her browser history revealed frequent visits to a dating site catering to married individuals seeking affairs. Under the username Blue-Eyed Dreamer, Jessica had been corresponding with several men over the past 6 months. One conversation in particular stood out. A user named Legal Eagle 75 had exchanged increasingly intimate messages with Jessica. Their last interaction was a cryptic message sent the night of her murder. "Can't wait to see you. Our usual spot, 11 p.m. Reeves leaned back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. Could this Legal Eagle 75 be the owner of the unknown number in Jessica's phone records? And more importantly, could he be her killer? Meanwhile, Detective Chen had been digging into James Hartley's background. On the surface, he was the epitome of success, a partner at a prestigious law firm, active in local politics, and by all accounts, a loving father. But as Chen peeled back the layers, cracks began to appear in this perfect facade. "Michael, you need to see this," Chen said, barging into Reeves' office. She laid out a series of financial documents on his desk. "James Hartley has been embezzling from his law firm. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars over the past year." Reeves studied the documents, his brow furrowed. "Motive," he muttered. "If Jessica found out about this..." "Exactly," Chen nodded. "And there's more. I spoke with his secretary. Apparently, James has been acting strange for weeks, canceling appointments, taking long lunches, coming in late. She overheard him arguing on the phone several times, but she couldn't make out what it was about. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but James Hartley remained elusive. His face was plastered across every news channel and social media platform, yet there had been no confirmed sightings. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist. As the investigation entered its second week, a breakthrough finally came. The unknown number in Jessica's phone records was traced to a burner phone purchased with cash at a convenience store just outside of Millbrook. Security footage from the store showed a man buying the phone, his face obscured by a baseball cap. But it wasn't James Hartley. The man in the footage was tall and lean, with a distinctive tattoo visible on his forearm. Reeves had the image enhanced and distributed to the media, hoping someone would recognize the mysterious figure. Within hours, tips began pouring in. One name kept coming up, Dr. Alexander Kane, a prominent surgeon at Millbrook General Hospital. Dr. Kane was known for his skill with a scalpel and his reputation as a ladies' man. He was also married, with a wife who was currently in Europe on a business trip. Reeves and Chen arrived at Dr. Kane's upscale condo, search warrant in hand. As they approached the door, they heard a crash from inside, followed by the sound of breaking glass. Chen drew her weapon, nodding to Reeves. "Police! Open up!" Reeves shouted, pounding on the door. After a tense moment, the door swung open. Dr. Kane stood before them, his shirt unbuttoned and a glass of whiskey in his hand. "I suppose this was inevitable," he said with a resigned sigh. Over the next few hours, Dr. Kane painted a picture of his relationship with Jessica Hartley. They had met at a charity gala 6 months ago, and what started as harmless flirtation quickly escalated into a full-blown affair. They would meet at a small cabin just outside of town, away from prying eyes. "I loved her," Kane said, his voice cracking. "We were going to leave our spouses, start a new life together. But then what?" Reeves pressed. Kane took a shaky breath. "Jessica called me that night around 10:45. She was crying, saying she couldn't go through with it, that she loved her kids too much to leave them. I tried to change her mind, but she hung up on me. That was the last time I spoke to her." "And where were you between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. that night?" Chen asked, her pen poised over her notepad. Kane's face fell. "I was at the cabin waiting for her. I thought maybe she'd change her mind, but she never showed up. I swear I didn't hurt her. I could never." As Kane broke down in sobs, Reeves and Chen exchanged glances. They had no choice but to take him in for further questioning. But something didn't add up. If Kane was telling the truth, then who killed Jessica Hartley? And where was James? As news of Dr. Kane's involvement spread, the quiet town of Millbrook was thrown into chaos. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion, wondering what other secrets lurked behind closed doors. The Hartley children, now staying with their grandparents, became the subject of whispered conversations and pitying looks. Emma, the older of the two, was old enough to understand that something terrible had happened to her mother. She withdrew into herself, barely speaking and refusing to eat. Ethan, too young to fully grasp the situation, kept asking when Mommy and Daddy were coming home. The weight of their innocence and confusion hung heavy over the investigation. At Millbrook General Hospital, Dr. Kane's colleagues were in shock. Nurse Pamela Rodriguez, who had worked closely with Kane for years, couldn't believe the allegations. "He's a brilliant surgeon," she told reporters camped outside the hospital. "Sure, he flirted a bit, but murder? It just doesn't seem possible." But as more details of the affair came to light, public opinion began to turn against both Kane and Jessica. Online forums buzzed with speculation and judgment. Some painted Jessica as a homewrecker who got what she deserved, while others saw Kane as a predator who took advantage of a vulnerable woman. The truth, as always, was far more complicated. Detective Reeves, for his part, was growing increasingly frustrated. While Kane's alibi for the night of the murder was shaky, there was no physical evidence tying him to the crime scene, and James Hartley was still in the wind, his disappearance becoming more suspicious with each passing day. 2 weeks after Jessica's murder, a hiker made a grisly discovery in the woods near the cabin where Kane and Jessica had conducted their affair. Partially hidden under a pile of leaves and branches was a blood-stained kitchen knife, matching the type used to kill Jessica. Forensics teams descended on the area, combing every inch for additional evidence. As they searched, one of the technicians called out, pointing to something glinting in the underbrush. It was a man's wedding ring, engraved with the initials JH. Reeves felt a surge of adrenaline. This was the break they'd been waiting for. But as he surveyed the scene, a nagging question gnawed at him. Was this evidence, or was someone trying to frame James Hartley? Back at the station, the forensics report on the knife came in. The blood was a match for Jessica Hartley, and there were traces of DNA that didn't belong to her. But to everyone's surprise, it wasn't James Hartley's DNA. It wasn't Dr. Kane's either. "We got an unknown suspect," Reeves announced to the team. "Someone who's not in the system. We need to cast a wider net." As the investigation took this new turn, Jessica's best friend, Diane Foster, approached the police with new information. She had been hesitant to come forward earlier, fearing she might be betraying her friend's confidence. But with the case at a standstill, she felt she had no choice. "Jessica told me something a few weeks before she died," Diane said, her voice trembling. "She said she had discovered something terrible, something that could ruin multiple lives. I thought she was talking about her affair, but now I'm not so sure." "Did she give you any specifics?" Chen pressed. Diane shook her head. "No, she was very vague. But she mentioned something about the hospital. She seemed scared, Detective. Really scared." This new information shifted the focus of the investigation back to Millbrook General Hospital. What could Jessica have discovered there that was worth killing for? As Reeves and Chen dug into the hospital's records, they uncovered a tangled web of corruption that went far beyond a simple affair. It appeared that several high-ranking hospital administrators, including the chief of surgery, were involved in a massive Medicare fraud scheme. Millions of dollars had been siphoned off through fake procedures and inflated bills. Dr. Kane's name appeared in several of these fraudulent records, but he was far from the only doctor involved. The scheme reached the highest levels of hospital management and even implicated several local politicians who sat on the hospital's board. "This is bigger than we thought," Reeves said, poring over the documents. "If Jessica stumbled onto this, it would give a lot of powerful people motive to want her silenced," Chen finished. As they continued their investigation, another piece of the puzzle fell into place. James Hartley's law firm had been representing the hospital in several recent legal matters. Had he known about the fraud? Was he involved? Just as the detectives were preparing to bring in hospital administrators for questioning, they received an urgent call from the station. James Hartley had finally surfaced in a small town in Mexico. He had been found in a rundown motel, barely conscious, with a note beside him that read, "I'm sorry, I couldn't protect her." James Hartley was extradited back to the United States, where he was immediately taken into custody. As he recovered in the hospital wing of the county jail, he finally revealed where he had been and what he knew. "I didn't kill Jessica," he said, his voice weak and his eyes sunken. "I was trying to save her." According to James, he had discovered the hospital's Medicare fraud while working on a case. He had confronted the hospital board, threatening to expose them unless they came clean and made restitution. They had agreed, or so he thought. What James didn't know was that Jessica had independently stumbled upon evidence of the fraud through her friendship with Diane, whose husband worked in the hospital's billing department. Jessica had confided in Dr. Kane, not realizing he was involved. "The night she died," James continued, his voice breaking, "Jessica called me. She said she had proof of the fraud and was going to turn it over to the authorities. I tried to tell her it was being handled, but she wouldn't listen. She said she couldn't live with the guilt of keeping it secret." James had rushed home, hoping to stop Jessica from going public and potentially putting herself in danger. But by the time he arrived, it was too late. He found her body on the lawn and panicked. "I knew how it would look," he said, tears streaming down his face. "Me, there with her body. I froze. I just ran. I thought if I could find the proof she had, I could clear my name and find her killer. But I couldn't find anything. And then I heard I was a suspect, and I just kept running." As James's story unfolded, the pieces began to fall into place. The unknown DNA on the murder weapon, the complex web of lies and deceit, the desperate actions of powerful people with everything to lose. In the days that followed, arrests were made across Millbrook. Hospital administrators, doctors, and even 2 local politicians were taken into custody. The Medicare fraud scheme was blown wide open, making national headlines. Dr. Alexander Kane, facing charges of fraud and obstruction of justice, agreed to cooperate with the investigation in exchange for leniency. His testimony would prove crucial in unraveling the full extent of the conspiracy. But the question remained: who had actually killed Jessica Hartley? The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Nurse Pamela Rodriguez, who had initially defended Dr. Kane, came forward with crucial information. She had seen someone leaving the hospital in a hurry on the night of the murder, carrying a bag that clinked like it was full of surgical instruments. That person was Dr. Victor Mehta, the chief of surgery and the mastermind behind the Medicare fraud. When confronted with this information and the DNA evidence, Dr. Mehta finally confessed. He had gone to the Hartley home that night, intending to threaten Jessica into silence. When she refused to back down, he had lost control and stabbed her repeatedly with a scalpel from his medical bag. "She was going to ruin everything," Mehta said during his confession. "All those years of work, the reputation I built, I couldn't let her destroy it all." The case that had gripped Millbrook and the nation for weeks was finally solved. James Hartley was cleared of all charges related to Jessica's murder, though he still faced legal consequences for his role in covering up the fraud. In the months that followed, Millbrook struggled to come to terms with the tragedy that had unfolded in their midst. The community rallied around Emma and Ethan Hartley, setting up a trust fund for their future and offering support to their grandparents, who now had the daunting task of raising them. Jessica Hartley was remembered not as the victim of a sordid affair, but as a woman who had been willing to risk everything to expose the truth. A scholarship was established in her name at the local community college, aimed at supporting students interested in investigative journalism. Millbrook General Hospital underwent a complete overhaul of its administration and practices. The Medicare fraud had shaken public trust, and it would take years to rebuild the hospital's reputation. Detective Michael Reeves, hailed as a hero for his tireless work on the case, found himself unable to shake the impact of the investigation. He took a leave of absence from the force, using the time to write a book about the case and advocate for better oversight in the healthcare system. Dr. Alexander Kane served a reduced sentence for his role in the fraud, but his medical license was permanently revoked. Last reports placed him working as a medical consultant for a pharmaceutical company, his days in the operating room long behind him. James Hartley, after serving time for his role in the initial cover-up, dedicated himself to raising his children and working to clear his late wife's name. He became an advocate for whistleblower protection, using his legal expertise to help others who found themselves in impossible situations. As for Millbrook itself, the town would never be quite the same. The facade of suburban perfection had been shattered, revealing the complex and sometimes dark reality that lay beneath. But from this tragedy came a newfound commitment to transparency and community, a determination to learn from the past and build a better future. The case of Jessica Hartley served as a stark reminder that even in the quietest of towns, secrets and lies can fester, with deadly consequences. It was a lesson that Millbrook, and indeed the entire nation, would not soon forget. 5 years after Jessica Hartley's murder, a small group gathered at Millbrook Cemetery to mark the anniversary of her death. Emma and Ethan, now teenagers, stood hand in hand before their mother's grave, their faces a mixture of sadness and resolve. James Hartley, his hair now streaked with gray, placed a bouquet of blue irises, Jessica's favorite, on the headstone. Diane Foster, still carrying the weight of her friend's confidences, stood quietly to the side, offering silent support. Detective Reeves, long since returned to the force, watched from a respectful distance. The case had changed him, had changed them all. As he looked at the Hartley children, he saw not just the tragedy of their loss, but the strength they had found in its wake. As the small ceremony concluded, Emma approached Reeves, her eyes so like her mother's, meeting his directly. "Thank you," she said simply, "for not giving up." Reeves nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "Your mother was a brave woman," he replied. "She deserved nothing less." As the group dispersed, Reeves lingered for a moment, looking out over the peaceful cemetery. The Jessica Hartley case had been solved, but its impact continued to ripple through Millbrook and beyond. It was a reminder of the power of truth, the weight of secrets, and the unexpected courage that can emerge in the face of injustice. In the end, Jessica Hartley's legacy was not the scandal of her affair or the tragedy of her death, but the change she had set in motion. Her story had exposed corruption, sparked reforms, and reminded a community of the importance of integrity and compassion. As Reeves turned to leave, a gentle breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the sweet scent of spring flowers. In that moment, he could almost believe that Jessica Hartley was at peace, her truth finally told, her sacrifice not in vain. The detective walked back to his car, the weight of the past 5 years heavy on his shoulders, but his step lighter than it had been in a long time. There would be other cases, other mysteries to solve, but the case of Jessica Hartley would stay with him always, a testament to the complexity of human nature and the enduring power of the truth.